John Burrison is professor of English and director of folklore curriculum at Georgia State University. He's an author of Brothers in Clay. Dr. Burrison's research is concentrated on the folk culture of the southeastern United States and on the British Isles. His interests include both oral literature and traditional crafts with a specialization in folk pottery. He served as curator here at the Atlanta History Center for our exhibition, Shaping Traditions, Folk Art in the Changing South, which is still up and running and one of my favorites. I wish you would see it. If you haven't, when the lecture is over, please go. It's probably one of the best regional exhibitions I've ever seen of folklore, folk life. And by regional, I mean beyond Atlanta. It's the whole region here. And nearly 7,000 school children every year visit Shaping Traditions, and they're guided through with their field trips. The Keenan Research Center here at the Atlanta History Center holds nearly 1,500 interviews from the John Burrison Folklore Collection. So you can see we've had a long tradition and working relationship with John. In addition to his role as curator of Shaping Traditions exhibition, John serves as curator of the Folk Pottery Museum of Northeast Georgia at Sawtee, Nakuchi Center near Helen, Georgia, which opened in 2006. Please welcome John Burrison. Mr.
Thank you. Sal mentioned Joe Dabney's new book on low country cooking, and I just want to plug that. I haven't seen it yet, but I can guarantee that it'll be one of the best books on Southern food you'll ever see, because I know Joe's work, and he and I have worked together on a number of projects, and he did a wonderful book on mountain cooking, Appalachian cooking. And it isn't just recipes, it's the whole cultural fabric into which that food fits with a historical background. So that should be a great thing for you to get. But I'm here today to talk about my new book, which is called From Mud to Jug, The Folk Potters and Pottery of Northeast Georgia. And it's a sequel and companion to my first book, Brothers in Clay, which some of you know. I know there are a few pottery enthusiasts in the group, and a few former students as well from my Georgia State courses. That book was published in '83, so you do the math. From Mud to Jug came out this year, over 25 years, I guess. Not that my math skills are all that good, but I thought it was time to update the story for that part of the state where there was an active living tradition of folk pottery. And when I first came to Georgia, I knew nothing about pottery, traditional pottery in particular. I think the closest I'd ever come to pottery was when I was a summer camp counselor on the eastern shore of Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, and I dated the pottery instructor, who was from Virginia, and I remember her pronunciation, her southern pronunciation of the word kiln as kill with a silent N, which is also the way it's pronounced in England. So southern potters have kept going that old English way of pronouncing the word. But in '68, I walked into Lanier Metters' workshop up in Mossy Creek in southern White County on the tail end of an exhibit I was working on of North Georgia folk crafts, working with people like Charles Counts and Bob Owen. And I had avoided pottery because, well, I'd seen a lot of old pots in junky antique shops, which no longer exist. There just aren't any of those left anymore. Basically, you go into a place and the dealers know exactly what these things are worth. You can't, in those days, a good North Georgia mid-19th century or late 19th century pot in good condition went for $10. That same pot will go for $500 perhaps, without anything special about it. So I'd been avoiding pottery, but I was with a reporter from the Journal-Constitution, and he was doing a story on Georgia State's folklore program. This would have been in '68. And we happened to be in the area, and I'd heard that Lanier's dad, Cheever Metters, had just died, and I was curious to see what was going on, whether Lanier was carrying it on, because he had been in the film that the Smithsonian did on the Metters pottery, kind of took over the role of his dad, Cheever, who had been quite ill at the time. And we stopped, and it was a rainy March day, and there was smoke coming out of the stovepipe and the tar paper shack that he had built to replace the old log shop for his dad. And he came out and invited us in, and that led to 14 years of blood, sweat, and tears researching Brothers in Clay. Because after getting to know Lanier, I realized that he was just the visible tip of a very important historical iceberg that had never really been documented for this state before. And at that time, for any other state in the South, there had been studies of New England, Laura Woodside Watkins's book, pioneering book on early New England pottery, an even more pioneering book by Edwin Adley Barber on Pennsylvania German tulipware, as he called it, slip-decorated earthenware. But the South was still unknown territory, and people were constantly making mistakes in their ceramics publications about what this Southern pottery was, what the alkaline glazes were, being called lead glazes and salt glazes when they really weren't. So 14 years of work, and then that pretty well exhausted me when it came to Georgia pottery, and I moved on to other projects like traditional storytelling and exhibits like the one here at the Atlanta History Center, and finally, their conditions were right for me to get back to the subject. And there were really kind of three motivating forces that made me go back to Northeast Georgia and reconnect. I had been keeping in touch with some of the key potters there, like the Hewells and the Fergusons, but there were others who had emerged that I hadn't known about in the interim of a younger generation, many of whom had been trained in the garden pottery business at places like Craven's and Hewells. And I wanted to reconnect with that and update the story. We've got in this country a situation where a few greedy businessmen and bankers have almost brought this country to its knees. And I don't have to tell you how that's impacted small businesses. So the relevance here is that these potters are small businesses. Some of them are just one-person operations. That's a small business. But they're not making pottery for fun as a hobby. They're making it to sell, to support themselves, and some of them do it full-time, and that is their entire income. And they are hurting in this economy just as much as everybody else is. And I've seen it happen. I've talked to the potters, and I knew that something needed to be done to stimulate the interest in their work, in their artistry, which I think is tremendous, and to develop a whole new coterie of connoisseurs, of collectors who would support these potters to keep them. I've seen 3 of these potters drop out just in the last year as a result of the economy, out of maybe 25 or so who are in business. So that was one of the motivations for this book. Another was the director of the University of Georgia Press, Nicole Mitchell. They've got a series on Georgia decorative arts, and every now and then she stopped by the office from Athens and came to Georgia State and talked to me about potential projects. And she encouraged me to do this book, and she thought if they could get a subsidy for it from the Wormslow Foundation in Savannah and from several private collectors in Athens, they could do a beautiful book with lots of color illustrations. There are over 100 color illustrations. It's a real luxury. To sell a book with that much going for it visually for under $30, I think, is extraordinary. But that couldn't have happened without the subsidies. And the other reason for this book is my connection with the Folk Pottery Museum at Sauti Nakuchi. When I finished curating the Shaping Traditions exhibit here, 600 folk artifacts, multiple levels of bureaucracy to deal with, to pass judgment on my work and put their stamp of approval. I was just exhausted with that, and I just didn't want to do another exhibit, another big exhibit, ever. And I got a phone call inviting me to curate this new museum that I'd heard rumors about up in the hills, about 4.5 miles southeast of Helen, Georgia, Alpine Helen, Georgia. And my first thought was, no way. But I agreed to meet with the people responsible, especially Dean and Kay Swanson, who were the benefactors. They had owned a telephone company in northeast Georgia, sold it for millions of dollars, and they wanted to give back to their area. And a local potter up there with an enormous collection of North Georgia pottery and a traditional potter himself, Michael Crocker, persuaded them that the best way to do that was to build a museum celebrating one of the most unique aspects of North Georgia history and life, and art. And so they put about $3.5 million into this project so that we didn't have to worry about fundraising. They basically gave me a blank check for my work, which I gave back to them because after I realized that this was going to work and this was going to be a great project and that it was something I really needed to be involved in, I didn't want to be paid for it. So that's the background of the book. Now I've got some illustrations here that come out of the book, and we'll start with a corner cupboard you can see in the Shaping Traditions exhibit, not quite as full of North Georgia folk pottery as it was when I took this photo for an earlier exhibit here called Tangible Traditions that was in where the old museum was in McElreath Hall before they built this new museum. It's made out of yellow pine, and it was probably built, the corner cupboard, by John Milton Medders, the founder of Medders Pottery. It came out of his house, and he was known as a carpenter and a blacksmith. And he wasn't a potter himself, but he was surrounded by potters there in Mossy Creek, and his family had married into one of those families, the Dorseys. And so it seemed natural, with 6 sons at home, to build a pottery shop and to hire a couple of the local potters from the older families to teach his older sons how to make pottery and to work with them. And they then taught their younger brothers until finally Cheever Medders took over the shop in 1920. The others moved out and set up their own shops. One of them, Casey Medders, moved up to Catawba, North Carolina, where he may have introduced the idea of the face jug to the Catawba Valley potters up there. That Berlin Craig, probably the North Carolina's version of Lanier Medders, if you will, two of the most famous folk potters in the United States, both National Heritage Fellows. Anyway, he may have built that cabinet. I like to think he did, probably in the 1870s. And you have alkaline glazed pottery spanning about a century, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, more or less. So that's the kind of pottery we're talking about. How is this pottery tradition carried on? There are 2 basic ways that traditional crafts are learned and transmitted from generation to generation. And one of them literally is generational in a family setting. This is the Huell family of Gillsville, in northeast Georgia, Hall County, just east of Gainesville. And you've got 4 generations there, and 3 more historical generations behind them, 7 generations that we know of, winding up with little Eli Huell at the wheel, who is now a big boy. I think he's about 12 right now, and he's working in the shop full-time when he's not in school. And there is his dad on the right, and Matthew, and then there is his great-granddad, Harold, in the middle, and there is his granddad, Chester, on the left, and all of them are really responsible for what he's doing. The other way you can learn a traditional craft is through apprenticeship. And in a more formal apprenticeship situation, typically a young person, a young teenager, might apprentice with a master craftsman for, say, 7 years, and then work in a number of other shops as a kind of journeyman. And finally, if he's able to establish his own shop and become his own master and take on apprentices. Well, that wasn't done so frequently in the rural South as in more urban areas of the United States and back in Europe. In the South, a lot of these crafts traditions were family traditions, primarily. But one situation in which apprenticeship could occur, and still does occur, is in these garden pottery operations, the Huells and the Cravens, where young men are trained by older workers there to make unglazed garden pots, hand-thrown on the wheel. And then they take those hand skills and go back to the older glazed wares and infuse them with a kind of modern artistic spirit. Because, well, as I'll show you, the market for this pottery has changed pretty dramatically. This is a map of the Georgia pottery centers and others here in the Southeast. So you can see the pattern. A lot of these pottery centers specialized in stoneware, which is a very durable, tough product made of high-firing, fine-grained, relatively pure clay. And you find your stoneware clay in this part of the country either along the fall line, that dotted line that runs through middle Georgia, and scattered in deposits above in the Piedmont Plateau, including the Atlanta area. There was a pottery center just down the road where the West Paces Ferry Shopping Center now is, up through the 1920s. And there were 7 pottery shops, folk pottery operations there until then, the Brown pottery being the last one to close. So you can see also a pattern of movement of potters from the Carolinas, and for Northeast Georgia in particular, the 3 pottery centers, Gillsville, Mossy Creek, and Barrow County, they were settled by potters coming down either from North Carolina or over from the old Edgefield district of west central South Carolina, which is probably where the alkaline glazes first started, were developed probably by brothers of the Landrum family, about 1810, 1815. We'll say more about the alkaline glazes in a bit. And this was a typical folk pottery workshop in the hills of North Georgia. Daddy Bill Dorsey's shop, they didn't call them studios. That's a kind of self-conscious artistic term. They didn't have a display room, a showroom for their ware. They pulled the pots out of the kiln and dumped them on the ground, and people came by and bought them that way. But this is a typical setup, a log pottery shop. Daddy Bill is the gentleman second from the left with the beard, and you can't see it really at this point. You need a magnifying glass, but there's a pipe sticking out of his mouth. He's smoking a pipe. And those are 2 of the hired workers who worked for him. And then on the right are his 3 sons, who also worked at the shop. And behind them is the tunnel, the railroad tunnel kill that is typical of North Georgia. And you can see a hole in the chimney at the far right, which is where the potters loaded and unloaded the pots. And then at the other end was the firebox that was fueled with wood. That was the fuel. And that photograph dates to about 1910, and along with that photo is this actually remarkably rare photo that we turned up in the Dorsey family of Daddy Bill Dorsey's pottery being sold on the road out of covered wagons. And so either members of his family or middlemen peddlers would take these wares up into the mountains, all the way up into North Carolina, down further south in Georgia, middle Georgia, Crawford County, Jugtown. Some of the potters sold their wares that wound up down in South Georgia, almost extreme South Georgia. So that's how the pots were distributed. And, you know, even though there were a dozen of these operations around 1900 in Mossy Creek, the potters weren't bumping into each other, competing for sales so much, because each of them had established different hauling routes, and they sold a lot of their pots right out of the shop, or out of the yard, as they called it, in the fall, which was the canning season when a lot of food had to be preserved, because that's really what this pottery was about. It was about food and drink storage and preservation. Not so much serving food, eating off of plates and drinking out of cups and so on. That was typically imported stuff. But what the folk potters made was ware that allowed folks in the South to survive through the winter by putting up their butchered meat, their produce, all of that, their dairy products, to keep it from spoiling in the warm climate as well. And this is an illustration from the book based on a tableau we've set up at the Folk Pottery Museum in Northeast Georgia to illustrate one of the situations in which this pottery was used. This is a spring house, natural refrigeration. A lot of farms in North Georgia if they had a spring on their property, they'd excavate, line it with stone, build a little shed over it, and keep their dairy products cool in that water or around where even in the summer it could be cool. This is the earliest dated North Georgia pot from Mossy Creek, White County. And this is kind of an interesting story of discovery. About 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, a dealer from Cleveland, Georgia, White County, came to Atlanta to show me this pot to determine whether it really was from White County and what its importance was, because he had a customer who wanted to buy it, but the customer needed some confirmation. So I looked at it, I made notes. It's inscribed with a name on the bottom, which is unusual. That's where studio potters typically sign their work, but not folk potters. But on the base, it says Josiah Vanderfer, his year, and then there's a date, 1832. Well, working on this book, I wanted to get a picture of that pot, but I'd lost track of it after 15 or so years. And I looked through my notes and I found the dealer's name, and of course the chances of him still being alive and the phone number still being there were good, in fact, because I called the number. His wife got him to the phone. He remembered the pot, he remembered who he sold it to, and he also knew that the person he'd sold it to, a collector up in White County, had wound up selling it to the High Museum of Art. And it was in the High Museum of Art storage collection. And they didn't really understand the importance of it. although they paid a considerable sum for it. So I got in touch with some contacts at the High Museum, and they agreed to lend this pot to the Folk Pottery Museum up in the hills, where it is on exhibit now, at least for a year, maybe longer. There's nothing particularly decorative about it. I don't know whether you'd want to call it a work of art, although it is beautifully potted, very elegant, almost classical looking with that tall neck. But it's a jar for preserving solid food, for pickling vegetables or meat. And it was probably made by one of the pioneer Mossy Creek potters when a member of the Vandiver family, one of the early settlers of what was then Habersham County, stopped by and said, my wife is about to have a child, or just has had a child. It must have been just has had a child, because they wouldn't have known the gender at that point. Could you make this pot as a special commemoration of the birth? That's my guess. We don't really know the whole story. But this, so far, is the earliest date for a North Georgia piece of folk pottery. The earliest date for a Middle Georgia piece of folk pottery from Washington County, East Central Georgia, is 1821. And you don't get much earlier for stoneware, southern stoneware, alkaline glaze stoneware than that. This is an alkaline glaze, wood ash or lime-based, not sure which of the two versions from this example. This is a later piece from the 1870s or 1880s. This is the Dorsey family. This is another member of the Dorsey family, Tarp Dorsey. And this is his syrup jug for keeping cane syrup. It would have been sorghum syrup. And you would keep this in the smokehouse and bring it into the kitchen, pour it into pitchers for table use, or use it in the kitchen to sweeten food. And this is all the sweetening, along with honey, that a lot of people in the South had because sugar was so expensive in the 19th century. It wasn't until the early 20th century that sugar became affordable to ordinary Southerners. Back in the antebellum period, folks locked their solid sugar cones up in a special piece of furniture called a sugar chest, and had a lock on it. So sugar was special, syrup was the normal sweetening, and these syrup jugs were essential. And their model, actually, I'm pretty sure, goes back to northern England and maybe lowland Scotland, where I've seen very similar pieces. This is another early piece, 1860s. This is R.V. DeLay, Russell Van DeLay, food storage jar. Barrow County, what is now Barrow County, what was then Jackson County. It's an ash version of alkaline glaze, apparently, although it's pretty smooth for ash glaze. What's interesting about it is that he has signed his name using the local identification mark, a circle. And he's taken that circle stamp, which you see up on the upper shoulder, and he's gone all around the belly of the piece with his name. He wanted people to know who made that jar. He was very proud of it. And that's in the Folk Pottery Museum as well. And here's a piece from the mountains. Now, there weren't many traditional potters working in the mountains. We think, you know, all the craftsmanship that's going on in Appalachia, there ought to have been a big pottery tradition. There wasn't. There just apparently wasn't enough good quality clay to work with in many parts of the mountains. But there were a few scattered mountain potters in North Georgia, and one of them operated a shop at Young Cane near Blairsville in Union County, the Jones Pottery. And this was made by James Jones because he signed it. We know that. We don't have a date, but it's probably 1870s. And it's a special piece. It was probably made as a wedding gift. And it's kind of the North Georgia version of the English quintal, which is a five-necked jug for displaying cut flowers. A form that goes back ultimately to Holland, before that to Persia, before that to China and Japan, before that to Egypt. It's actually one of the oldest pottery forms in the world, thousands of years old. But James Jones made that, and that's got an ash version of alkaline glaze. Even in the early 20th century, you had potters making a few special pieces that were as much decorative as they were functional. And the face jug tradition is a good illustration of that. This is a piece by Cheever Metters. Cheever didn't like to make these. He was a very utilitarian potter. He said, by the time I get it all fixed up with the eyes and the nose and the mouth, I could have made 3 useful pieces, like pitchers. But at that point, by the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, the Metters pottery was attracting a collector's market as the demand for utilitarian farm wares declined. Cheever continued making those, but collectors would come and twist his arm to make a face jug, and maybe he made a couple of dozen in his whole career, and this is a typical example. There's really nothing terribly artistic about it. It's not sculpted in a special way. Later on, Lanier Metters began to do some very artistic things with this form, cave in the cheeks to humanize it, gave them expressions, made them look like people he knew, people he was seeing on TV. He had a whole series of Richard Nixon experiencing the Watergate phenomenon, Idi Amin, and so on. This is a kind of an early looking face jug, and compare this with Lynn Craven's work of a later generation. Lynn, growing up in one of the oldest pottery families in the South, originating in North Carolina, maybe back in England. But her branch of the family, after they moved to North Georgia, her father and grandfather had quit pottery. And so she had to learn as an adult, after her children had grown up, by apprenticing with Bobby Ferguson, a member of another older pottery family going back at least 5 generations to the old Edgefield district of South Carolina. So she didn't grow up with this tradition. That gave her apparently some more freedom to do her own thing with the tradition. And so she did a whole series of Native American totem face jugs. This one, an owl totem, using a lot of color in her work as well. A bit on the production process. You start with clay. Now, any of you potters in the audience, where do you get your clay? Uh-huh. You don't go out in your backyard and dig it, do you? Yes. These potters didn't have the luxury of being able to buy prepared clay from a supplier. They settled in those parts of the South where they suspected there was good quality clay, and then they tested for it and found it. This is a hill of clay at Hewell's Pottery that's going to last them for the next 2 generations. And it's dug in a neighboring county from a large supply that they have access to, that they pay actually to dig from. And this is Lanier Metters in his prime when I knew him, 1978. And he was using a foot-powered potter's wheel, what we call a treadle wheel, not a true continental European kick wheel where you're contacting the flywheel directly with your foot, but here there's an intermediary link with a crankshaft and a foot bar, and so you're pushing the foot bar back and forth. And this style of wheel was developed in late 18th century England, as far as I've been able to find. And all early American stoneware potters used it, but the southern potters stand up at it. They don't sit down to work at the wheel. And the reason they stand up is that it gives them better purchase to pull up larger pieces of pottery. Because these potters could make things, I mean, on the average, 5 and 6 gallons. That's a big pot. If for a studio potter, you would know that. And there are examples, for example, by the enslaved African-American potter David Drake from Edgefield District, of 40 gallons. You could live in a pot that big. So that's linear at the wheel. And some of the folk potters who are working today still use this kind of wheel. Others use an electric wheel, but they still, of course, hand throw their pots in either case. These are 2 antebellum North Georgia whiskey jugs. Whiskey, of course, before there were, serious efforts to curtail alcoholic beverages in this country, even before Prohibition, was as much a medicinal as it was, for enjoyment. And a lot of North Georgians made their living making whiskey illegally, as it turns out, and some of them still do. And one of the chief products of the folk potter were these whiskey jugs. So these are 2 examples from before the Civil War. The one on the left, probably White County, 1830s, I would say, very early, lime-based alkaline glaze, typically smooth, light in color. The one on the right, maybe the Jones Pottery from Blairsville, ash-based version of alkaline glaze with a typical drippy texture, darker in color because the wood ash had minerals in it that would contribute to the color. But those are the 2 different versions of alkaline stoneware glaze that were typical for North Georgia. This is Chester Huell burning his wood-burning kiln. They also have 2 large, in their workshop, 2 large gas-fired, computer-controlled envelope kilns for their unglazed garden pottery. But for their glazed folk pottery, they do it the old way, the old-fashioned way, and that's how it's done. And again, there's a few folk potters who still have these wood-burning kilns. Others use gas or even electric kiln for their work. And this is Chester with a couple of his face jugs, illustrating the range of sizes. The big one you can see in the Shaping Traditions exhibit here, and the little one is similar to the one also in the exhibit. That's on his pocket watch. You see it on the floor. That's less than an inch tall. Those are hard to make. He doesn't have the patience to make many of them. So he got to where he was charging $400 for one, just to discourage people from ordering them. Meanwhile, Lynn Craven was making little face jugs of the same size for $5. And when I first met Lynn and saw her little face jugs, I said, "Lynn, you've got to charge more for those. Chester Huell was charging $400 for those." I came back a few months later, and she had taken my advice and was now charging $6. So this is Chester's son Matthew's work. Matthew is one of the star traditional potters at work in North Georgia today at Gilsville, and this is his Confederate widow, kind of counterbalancing his dad's rebel soldier figure. So you can see the tradition moving away from the utilitarian into things that are more artistic. Although the Huells are still production potters, they still crank out a lot of undecorated utilitarian pieces, especially their garden pots. This is Cleet Metters, who keeps threatening to quit pottery. He is the son of C.J. Cleeter Metters Jr. who is the son of Cleater Sr., who started out in Mossy Creek and then Cleveland, Georgia. Cleet has moved away from White County. He's now at Houston in Jackson County. And again, he's got a very artistic streak, and that's one of his face jugs, a devil jug. Michael Crocker, there are 3 Crocker brothers. That's a good name for a potter. This is his work. This is a big syrup jug with snake and grapes. The idea, the motifs coming from Ari Metters' work, Lanier Metters' mom, but pushing the envelope of that to make something more three-dimensional, standing out in deep relief. And again, a combination of utilitarian and artistic at the same time. This is his brother Dwayne Crocker with his specialty, the rooster, and some of his live models. And he sometimes adds snakes to his rooster. I especially like his ash glaze stoneware. And this is Charlie West, and this is his rooster. And this isn't stoneware, this is earthenware with more colorful earthenware glazes that are fired at a lower temperature. And this is one of Charlie's specialties. Charlie was trained in the garden pottery business, but it turns out he's the great-grandson of someone I knew in my early days in Georgia, North Georgia's greatest ballad singer, the late Lily West, who had a little general store up outside of Blairsville in Union County. So if it wasn't ballad singing, it was pottery in the West family. And this is the Folk Pottery Museum of Northeast Georgia, which I hope you all get to visit near Helen at Sawtee-Nakuchi, connected with the Sawtee-Nakuchi Center, built on the old high school there. And this is the project that Swanson's funded, and that is attracting a lot of attention in the museum world, and people are learning about it and making a trip specifically just to see the collection and the building itself, which is a beautiful building designed by an Atlanta architect, Robert Kane. So that's my presentation, and I guess we have time for questions. That was exactly 45 minutes.
Exactly. Good for you.
Any questions or thoughts? Yes? Well, have you taken a good look at the gift shop here? Because they're selling folk pottery.
But I have more of a presence.
Well, I think it's got a pretty good presence there, but, you know, that's a personal opinion. But go back in and take a look. Now, they don't have a lot right now. They need to restock. But what they've got, you know, you might see something you like. They've got a few pieces from the Ferguson family. They've got some really nice pieces from another member of the Hewell family who's doing very good work, including swirlware of the sort that really began in the Catawba Valley of North Carolina, but he's doing that. So, yes, I don't like to get too technical, but if somebody asks, I'm happy to respond. Earthenware is the earliest, first type of traditional pottery made anywhere in the world, including the United States. And earthenware, you can find the clay just about everywhere. It's typically a reddish color, coarse-grained, has a lot of iron impurity in it, fired at a relatively low temperature, tends to be porous unless you put a glaze on it. Native American pottery is earthenware. Colonial American pottery mostly is earthenware. In the European tradition, the glaze is a lead-based glaze, and that came to be a problem. People were dropping like flies from lead poisoning. And by the later 18th century, during the age of reason, with scientific exploration, people were discovering that lead wasn't such a good thing. And it was at that point that stoneware began to emerge as the dominant type of folk pottery, first in Europe, then in United States. So by the Revolutionary War era, there were a good number of stoneware potters in this country, but not really until the early 19th century did stoneware take off here in the South. And in Georgia, that was the dominant type of folk pottery. There really wasn't much of an earthenware tradition other than the Native American tradition, which of course we lost when we lost our Native American population. Stoneware is made from a harder to find, purer clay that fires a light gray or a light tan, is fine grained, has a lot of glassy material, silica and alumina in it, and it takes a much higher temperature to mature it until the glassy material melts out and permeates the ware to make it impervious to leaking. And that temperature is about 23 to 2400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty hot, considering that your kitchen ovens get up to about 500 degrees. But you've got to get the stoneware up to that heat and hold that heat for several hours in what the folk potters here call blasting off, before you can depend on that stoneware to resist leaking. But a glaze was put on it anyway as insurance to keep it potentially from leaking, but also for appearance's sake. And the glaze that we're talking about, the alkaline glazes, wood ash and lime-based glazes, had their inspiration, I am almost certain, in the Far East. So there's a Chinese component to this story. In the early 18th century, a French Jesuit missionary named Père d'Entrecôte published a series of letters from Qingtai-Chen, one of the big pottery centers in China still today, describing in elaborate detail the processes of pottery making, including the recipes for alkaline glazes, wood ash and lime-based glazes that the Chinese potters were using for their stoneware and in a more refined state for their porcelain. And so those letters were published in a book by a Frenchman named Duald. That was the book about China. Anybody who was interested in China during the 18th century and early 19th century got a hold of this book. And I suspect that Dr. Abner Landrum, who was a pretty sophisticated guy in the old Edgefield district of South Carolina, came across the Duald book or a reprint in some form from it of these glaze recipes and said, look, we've got great stoneware clay here on the fall line of South Carolina, but normally in the European tradition, you'd use salt to glaze stoneware. We don't have a lot of salt here in the backcountry, and when we have it, we use it. Our priority is to preserve food with it. We don't have a lot of excess salt to throw around in the kiln. So he read these letters, I suppose, and said, let's try this out. We're talking about wood ashes from the firebox of the kiln, talking about clay, same clay that the pots were made of. We're talking about sand or quartzite, or we're talking about, instead of wood ashes, lime, the same lime that's used for mortar, made from limestone or from seashells on the coast. Let's try this recipe out and see if it works. And by 1820, the first dated example of this glaze, signed by Dr. Abner Landrum on a very unimpressive little jar that has recently been discovered. His workmen were using these glazes, and many of them migrated west into Georgia, up into western North Carolina, into Alabama. They kept moving. By the 1850s, they were in East Texas with these glazes. So that's the alkaline glaze stoneware story in a nutshell. Other questions or thoughts? Yes. Macon mainly? Yeah. What you were digging up were old trash dumps. People threw those pots away the same way that we throw plastic milk jugs and glass jars and metal cans away today if we don't recycle them. They just, very frugal people thought of ways to recycle those pots once they were used for the first time. But a lot of people, particularly in Macon, and a lot of those, of course, were whiskey jugs. The potters made them, Crawford County potters made them for licensed distillers in Macon, who then sold them to taverns and so on. And then when the people bought them or when the tavern owners used them, they just dumped them. They just hauled them out to the dump and dumped them. We had a dump here in Atlanta where Maddox Park is now located that was just loaded with old pots and bottles, first discovered by bottle hunters digging that place up. And finally the city caught wind of it and started cracking down on all these potholes, literally potholes in the park. I came along later, and the stuff that the pot hunters and bottle hunters had thrown away on the surface, I just gathered them up and made a nice little collection out of them just to get a sense of what people in the Atlanta area were using back in the late 19th century. And it's amazing, there were still a lot of farms here in Atlanta. The Buckhead district, where those 7 folk pottery operations were, that was developed in the 1920s and eventually became incorporated into the city. But before that, they were farmers. And they had cows and they had chickens and pigs, and they needed those pots the same way that folks out in the country, way out in the country, did. In fact, the first folk pottery operation in Atlanta, I've learned, was located just exactly where Sparks Hall of Georgia State University is now. The Craven family, one of the Cravens, moved down from White County after coming down there from central North Carolina, from the Seagrove area, in 1824, and by the 1840s, he was in Atlanta, and he had a wood-burning kiln, and he would have had a mule mixing clay in the yard right there on the corner where my university is now located. And recently, they were excavating across the street, across Cortlandt Street, where the University Center is, and digging a big hole in the ground. And I noticed, looking at a profile of the cut, that there was a layer of beautiful gray clay, stoneware clay, that was probably Craven's source, right downtown in Atlanta. One of Bill Gordy's grandsons, Darrell Adams, took over Bill's operation at Cartersville for a few years, but there were, he moved on and sold it to a studio potter. And at that point, his work was kind of straddling the fence between folk pottery and studio pottery as well, as Bill himself sort of did. Bill Gordy had pushed the older tradition into kind of the studio pottery aesthetic with lots of colored glazes, but a lot of his shapes were harking back to the old utilitarian forms like jugs and churns and such. But he developed his own special glazes. He had a wonderful glaze called Mountain Gold glaze. And you can see a ring jug in the Jugtown section of the pottery area of the Shaping Traditions exhibit by Bill Gordy to get a sense of what happened to that tradition in his generation. That Mountain Gold glaze tended to be, it was a secret formula, of course, that he passed on to his grandson, Darrell Adams, but it was typically a kind of light tan, dark tan, golden, sometimes with little flashes of blue in it, and largely unpredictable in terms of what it would look like when it came out of the kiln, which is, of course, what the folk potters dealt with. You know, they could guess what it would look like after a lot of experience, but every kiln of ware was different. And some of them were so anxious to open up their kiln that they would unbrick the opening too early before the kiln had properly cooled down. And I've seen this happen, and you can hear ping, 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 ping. The pots were still hot and cracking from the contact with the cool air. Grace Huell is the oldest generation of the now 4 generations who are working at Huell's Pottery in Gillsville. And when I first started doing this research back in the really early 70s, as far as the Huells were concerned, I would visit the Huells, and nobody would tell me that there was a woman making pottery up there. Finally, Grace came. She made a point to come out and introduce herself to me, and brag about how many pots she'd made that day, more than any of the guys. And I got to know her, and she's super. She does, some fairly artistic stuff. You can see a few of her pieces in the exhibit. What I call her funky chicken is in one of the last sections of the exhibit. She's getting on in years, as is her husband, Harold, who's been pretty ill the last few years. So hard to say how much longer that generation will hold on. But now you've had little Eli and his sister, Susanna, his younger sister, are carrying on the Huell tradition into the, 8th generation now. There's still a few brick factories in the Atlanta area. I think the Chattahoochee Brick Company. And the process, even when it's become industrialized, is pretty much the same. You've got a mold, you slap a clay in it, you let it dry for a while, you remove the mold, and then you put the bricks in a kiln. A lot of the old potters, the Metterses did this, would stack the unfired bricks up to make a kiln, honeycombed with flues. They put their wood fuel in the fireboxes of those flues, and they'd burn that kiln for days. And then when it cooled down, they would unbrick the kiln, and there was nothing left. It wasn't a permanent structure, and that's called a stove kiln. But you could also burn your bricks in a regular stoneware kiln or some other kind of kiln. In the old days, before machines were developed for molding bricks, it was all done by hand, and they had wooden molds, typically a set of 4 bricks per mold. And again, you'd process your clay, which was an earthenware clay. You'd slap the clay in those molds, smooth the top over, eventually pull the mold off, and let the bricks dry thoroughly before you fired them in the kiln. That's the process.
How hot would that kiln be for that?
It would be earthenware temperature.
That's low.
Yeah, probably a little more than that. I'm a little confused these days because people are talking in Celsius rather than Fahrenheit, and those two things are very different. But 2,300 for stoneware, probably closer to 1,200 degrees for earthenware Fahrenheit. Now, a lot of the modern bricks are actually made from stoneware clay and are fired hotter. And ideally, in a pottery kiln, you want a high firing brick to build your kiln from if you're going to fire stoneware.
That would make us smart.
No, that's one of the mysteries. We don't know if that was a maker's mark. But that turns up on a lot of the marks. Typically, Crawford County potters marked their ware. The White County potters didn't so much. On the top of the loop handle, they would impress what was a carved wooden stamp so that the initials stood in relief. And that's a distinctive marking technique for Crawford County. So if you find a pot with initials standing up in relief on the loop handle, that's pretty much certain that it's from Crawford County. And a lot of the initials we've been able to figure out which families and which individuals, but the X is a mystery, whether that was somebody's name, whether it was just some person's way of identifying themselves so that the various potters who worked at a single site could each get paid for their day's work. That's probably why they were used. That was a different system, and we don't have enough information about that. But there are a few people doing research on Crawford County pottery beyond what I've done.
Very unusual.
Yeah. I've seen it used alone. I've seen it used in combination with other initials.
Single X.
Yeah, I don't know what the X means, sorry.
Take one more question, John.
One more question. Everything was done in gallon capacity. Hired potters were paid in terms of the number of gallons they threw that day. And you charged per gallon for pottery, and the size of the pot was usually indicated in gallon capacity by a numeral. In some cases, it was a Roman numeral. In Edgefield District, sometimes it was a series of dots or slashes to indicate the gallon number. Well, now, that's more typical of what you might see in Edgefield District, South Carolina. Well, I'd have to see it. You send me a digital photo via email, and I should be able to identify it if it's White County. Oh, thank you. I'll see it.
One more.